guys, welcome back to Beyond the Veil today.
hmm
So we're going to be doing some ghost stories that we've either found or that we know about. So yeah, we do something a bit different today.
Yep.
So if you so I'm Lady Amy,
I am Lady Coco.
and we shall be with you as always. Like I said, we're doing some ghost stories today. Um as opposed to a bit of gameplay, just switching it up. So yeah, would you like to kick us off, Coco?
Okay, so we each have 5 stories. Some are true, some are not, creepy aspects and stuff like that. So I'm going to begin with one called Harry.
Mm.
So, begin. So, such an ordinary things make me afraid. Hot sunny days, dark shadows on grass, children with red hair, and the name Harry. My daughter Christine was 5 years old. It was a hot sunny day and she was playing alone in the garden. I overheard her talking to someone. I went outside to see who it was, but there was nobody there. I was puzzled. Who are you talking to? I asked. Harry, she replied. Who's Harry? I asked. She shrugged her shoulders. Just Harry, she said. That evening, when my husband came home from work, I told him about it. He said it was normal for kids to have imaginary friends. I tried to put it out my mind, but something about that name, Harry, just sent a shiver down my spine. The next day, Christine was playing in the garden while I was in the kitchen. Again, I heard her talking to someone. When I looked out the window, I thought I could see a sharp, dark shadow on the grass. It looked like a person, but maybe it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. I tapped on the window and told Christine to come inside for dinner. Can Harry come too? She asked. No, I said. Harry has to stay outside. But he's hungry, she whined. Who is Harry? I asked. My brother, she replied. But you don't have a brother, I told her. Yes, I do, she said. His name is Harry. Who told you that? I asked. Harry. He told me, she said. My daughter spent every day in the garden talking to her imaginary friend. After a while, it began to worry me, so I took her to see a psychiatrist. All children need friends their own age, the psychiatrist told me. If they do not have friends, they invite them. It's a normal part of childhood. As soon as she starts school, she will forget all about it. Talking to the psychiatrist reassured me, but I couldn't help feeling nervous. A few days later, Christine started school. I dropped her off in the morning for her first day. I kissed her on the forehead and waved goodbye, then watched as she walked up to the front door of the school and went inside. There was something I had to do, so I took the bus into the city and made my way to a large grey building. It had been 4 long years since I visited the building. It was the orphanage where we adopted Christine. The woman who ran the orphanage opened the door and invited me inside. I told her I needed to know about Christine's history. Who was her birth parents? Where are they now? And have they died? How did they die? I'm sorry, the woman said. We have strict rules about divulging such information. I told her it was very important. I begged and pleaded. I got down on my knees and eventually the woman gave in. Very well, she said, but this must remain strictly between the two of us. Christine was born into a very poor family. Her parents didn't want her. They were drug addicts and neglected their children. The house the house they lived in was in a terrible condition. One night, the mother and father got into a violent argument. The father grabbed a knife and ended up stabbing his wife to death. He cut off her head. Then he attacked the children. Oh my god, I explained. When the police arrived, it was all over. They found Christine in the garden, clutched in the arms of her brother. She was unharmed, but her brother was dead. He had been fatally stabbed and he was dying. He managed to grab Christine, take her to safety, where they found their father and mother inside. The father had taken his own life. My eyes were welling up with tears. What was his name? I asked in a trembling voice. Her brother, what was his name? His name was Harry, she replied. I stumbled out the orphanage in a daze. I wandered through streets with no idea of where I was going. The name Harry was floating around in my brain. I felt like it was a nightmare. I was so frightened, but I didn't know why. Then I looked at my watch. It was after 3 o'clock. I had to pick up Christine from school, and I was already late. I hopped on a bus and eventually I arrived at the school. I walked down the hallway and went into the classroom, where I found the teacher gathering up her books. I'm so sorry I'm late, I gasped. Where's Christine? Christine, the teacher said. She's gone. Gone? I cried. Yes, her brother picked her up a few minutes ago. My heart sank into my chest. Without another word, I ran outside and started shouting my daughter's name. I was running down the street, searching for my daughter, screaming and crying hysterically. It was no use. She was gone. I spent the next 2 weeks in bed. The police searched for Christine, but they never found a trace of her. Her picture was in the newspaper, her face was on milk cartons, everybody was looking for her, but it was as if she just disappeared into thin air. After a while, people lost interest and the search was called off. It remained just another unsolved mystery. Years have passed since then, and the pain in my heart never goes away. The fear never ends. Such ordinary things make me afraid. Hot sunny days, dark shadows on grass, children with red hair, and the name Harry. That's your turn now.
That's spooky.
Mm.
So, I've story I'm going to be reading is called Earwig. So, the Earwig is a scary story about a man who puts a creepy crawly in another man's ear. Many years ago in Borneo, there was an Englishman named Clifford Macy who was young, handsome, and very vain. He fancied himself as God's gift to woman and often boasted about his success. Macy was part owner of a tobacco company, and his friend and business partner was another Englishman by the name of Leopold Warwick. Despite being old, fat, Warwick had a wife who was very young and beautiful, and she was the envy of every man who set eyes on her. The three of them lived together in a big house on the plantation. Macy slept in the first bedroom, while Warwick and his wife slept in the second. It was rainy season and there was precious little to do. Macy was bored and he could find nothing that would keep him entertained. As time went on, he developed a passion for Warwick's wife and began to wish that he could have her for himself. He tried flirting with her, but she wouldn't have anything to do with him. One evening, when the husband was away, Macy made a pass at her, but she slapped him across his face. However, Macy was the kind of man who didn't take no for an answer, and every time she rebuffed him, he became more and more obsessed with her until he was determined to have her at any cost. Although his heart was burning with a white-hot passion, Macy had a devilish and cunning mind. He soon came up with a way to get Warwick out of the picture. In Borneo, there is a type of earwig that lives on waxy secretions. It has a special liking for the human ear and is so small and light that it could be crawling on your face and you barely even feel it. If it gets into a man's ear, it creeps down into the canal, unable to turn around, feeding as it goes, and causing weeks of hellish torment until, well, I'm sure you can use your imagination. Macy paid two native men a large sum of money and instructed them to creep into Warwick's bedroom in the middle of the night and place an earwig on his pillow. He went to sleep that night with a smile on his face and dreamed about the horrible fate that was about to befall his friend. The next morning, when Macy came down to breakfast, Warwick seemed bright and cheerful. He watched the old man closely, looking for any signs of discomfort. Just then, Macy felt a strange tickling sensation in his own ear, and when he poked his finger down into the canal, he discovered that he was bleeding. Jumping up from his table with a look of horror on his face, he shrieked, "The damn thing! The damn thing is in my ear!" It appeared that the men had made a mistake, a terrible, terrible mistake, and during the night they had gone into the wrong room, placed the earwig in the wrong man's ear. That was the beginning of weeks of unimaginable pain and agony. There was nothing the doctors could do for him. He lay in his room, tied to the bed, with his wrists lashed to the headboard to prevent him from tearing his own ears off. Day and night he writhed and screamed as the earwig crept and crawled and twisted his way through his head, slowly driving him insane. On occasions, when the earwig was resting, Macy could get a break from his torment, but when it woke up, he would scream and scream and scream. The pain was so unbearable that being flayed alive, burnt at the stake, put on the rack, or even hung by the neck would have been an act of mercy. And every time the doctor came to see him, Macy begged him to be put out of his misery. Then something very unexpected happened. Miraculously, the earwig crawled out of his other ear. Macy had come so close to the brink of death, but he had survived the torment. When he was well enough to talk, the doctor come in to see him. "Well, I suppose they're going to call the police and have me arrested now," said Macy. "No," said the doctor, "they're not calling the police." "Why not?" Macy demanded. "I suppose they're trying to avoid a scandal." "No, they're taking pity on you," said the doctor. "You see, they know about your condition." "Condition? What do you mean?" asked Macy. "Well, you see," the doctor said, "the earwig was female, and it's laid eggs." That was the earwig.
Oh, lovely. Main reason why my mother has a terrible fear of them.
Same. My dad doesn't like earwigs either.
It's understandable. Alright, so my next one is called Spirit World. Um, right, so late one night, a shambling figure was made its way down a deserted city street. It arrived at an apartment building and went inside. The landlady caught a glimpse of the strange figure struggling up the stairs. All of a sudden, she heard a crash and the sound of splintering wood. Then there were terrified screams and the sound of terrible struggle. She ran to the phone and called the police. When she came back, there was a fearful silence. Curiously, curiously and cautiously, the landlady made her way up the stairs until she saw the broken door. It was the door to the apartment of one of her tenants, a university student named Michael Flynn. Peering through the doorway, she saw Michael lying on the floor. He was mortally injured and his face had been beaten to a pulp. She helped him onto the bed and tried to make him comfortable, but it was clear that he was dying. "What happened, Michael?" the landlady cried. Michael let out an agonized groan. "It all started with my lecturer at university," he said. "His name was Professor Jerome. He was an old man with grey hair and walked with a cane. He must have been about 70 years old. He was doing research in hypnotism, and I volunteered to be one of his test subjects. One evening, he invited me to his house. He wanted me to assist him with a hypnotic experiment. He told me he wanted to put me into a trance. I felt nervous, but I trusted him. After all, he was my professor. He took out his pocket watch and held it in front of my eyes. I watched it swing back and forth. I listened to the soothing sound of his voice, and gradually I felt myself falling into a trance. All of a sudden, I felt as if I was separating from my body. I was a free spirit, cut loose from flesh. I was floating up, and when I looked down, I saw my body sitting in a chair and Professor Jerome standing over me. The room started swirling around me, and then it simply vanished. I was moving through a new world, floating through a strange world of mist and shadow, drifting through an unearthly place of fog and darkness. I had no idea where I was or where I was going. Eventually, I wanted to go back to my body, so I floated back the way I had come. When I returned to the room, I was horrified to find my body was moving around on its own. Somebody had stolen it. I didn't have to look far for the culprit. Professor Jerome's body sat slumped in a chair. He was dead. It didn't take me long to work out what happened. While I was gone, he had left his body and taken over mine. His body was old and he knew he was going to die soon. So he stole a healthy young body, my body. I watched helplessly as Professor Jerome walked away with my body and set about living my life. I was trapped in the world of mist and shadow, doomed to wander aimlessly for all eternity. Without a body, I was nothing but a free spirit. It was a fate worse than death. I didn't know how long I lingered in the gloomy netherworld. Perhaps it was months, or maybe it was years. Finally, something struck me. It was so simple, and I wondered why I didn't think of it before. I searched and searched until eventually I found what I was looking for, the cemetery where Professor Jerome's body had been buried. I floated down through the earth and entered the coffin where I possessed the body. The rest of it was not easy, but I managed to claw my way out of that grave and pull myself up to the surface. When I stood up and tried to walk, I realized that too much time had gone by. Professor Jerome's body was now a rotting corpse. With every step I took, pieces of flesh were dropping off. I had to keep moving. My spirit controlled the awful decaying thing and forced it to keep moving forward. I made my way home, back to the apartment building, up the stairs, and I kicked the door down. You could imagine the horror on Professor Jerome's face, my face, when he turned around and saw his own rotting corpse standing in the doorway. His eyes grew wide, his jaw dropped open, and he began trembling and shaking with fear. I threw myself at him, and my bony fingers wrapped around his throat, strangling him. I was trying to throttle the life out of him. It was a terrible struggle. Each time I smashed my fist into his face, bits of my body would drop off. Each time I stomped on his head, my body would crumble more and more. I was falling to pieces, but I kept on beating him. Eventually, I accomplished what I had come to do. I had beaten him nearly to death. Professor Jerome's spirit, abandoning the dying body, my body, and floated up into the air. I was able to possess my own body again. I'm back. I'm back in my own body. Oh, how glorious it feels to be back. And with that, the student breathed his last breath, closed his eyes, and he finally died. There was a serene smile on his face. The landlady had listened to the entire story, but she didn't believe a word of it. However, when she turned on the lights, she was horrified to find the rotting corpse of an old man lying in pieces. That
Ooh,
one is mainly about astral travel. Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, if you were to astral travel, there is a huge chance somebody can, a spirit from the other side can possess your body. So always astral travel carefully.
make sure you have a boarding pass.
Yeah. Alright, your go. Your next one.
So, the next one I've got is called Human Bones. There was a village in Japan where the population was very small. A lot of people had left the village, and many of the houses were abandoned. One snowy day, a traveller came to this village looking for shelter. He saw what appeared to be an empty house, but when he went inside, was surprised to find an old woman standing there. The old woman told him to go up to the first floor, and she followed behind him. When he reached the top of the stairs and turned, she had disappeared. He walked back down the stairs and saw that the old woman was standing in the exact spot she'd been when he had entered, except now she was holding a sharp sickle in her hand. The man, very spooked by this, ran to the front door, but when he tried to pull it open, he found that it was locked. He turned to find the old woman standing right beside him. She grabbed hold of his arm, and in the darkness he hadn't noticed how pale she looked. But now that she was up close, he could see that her skin seemed to be rotting. She looked dead. The old woman squeezed his arm and hissed, "Listen to me. Under the house lies 13 bodies. Give them peace. If not, I will kill you." After she uttered these words, the man began to feel dizzy and collapsed to the floor. When he woke up, he had no idea how much time had elapsed. He began to doubt himself. Perhaps he'd dreamt the whole thing. He was about to leave when he noticed a mat in the middle of the room, where the old woman had been standing. There was a dark stain on it, pooling just underneath. He pulled back the mat and found it was covering a very large hole in the floorboards, and looking into the hole, he saw human bones neatly arranged underneath. The bones of 14 bodies were lying there. Why did she say 13? He murmured to himself. Perhaps the 14th set of bones belonged to the old woman. The traveller went outside and told some of the villagers of what had happened. And when he brought them back to the empty house, they looked down into the hole and saw the bones. But now there were only 13 sets of bones underneath the floorboards, and the old woman's bones were not there anymore. Afterwards, the villagers demolished the old house and built a shrine there instead. Inside the shrine, they placed a blood-stained mat so that people could offer prayers to the dead. The traveller and the villagers who discovered the dead bodies all soon died after the incident, and they never found the 14th set of bones. There we
Mm,
go. Mm.
very interesting. Right, so my next one is called the elevator buttons.
Mm-mm-mm-mm-mm.
When I was a child, my parents lived in an old apartment building that was 14 stories high. Like many buildings, it was built without a 13th floor. It went straight from the 12th floor to the 14th floor. However, the elevator still had a 13th button, even though it never worked. There were two other kids, Terry and June, who were living in the building. We were the same age, we went to the same school, and the three of us often played together in the evenings. One day, while we were waiting for our parents to come home, we decided to explore the roof of the apartment building. We took the elevator to the 14th floor, where we found the door to access the roof. After a while, we grew bored and went back downstairs in the elevator. When we were halfway down, June realised she had forgotten something. She had left a coat on the roof. She hit the stop button, then pressed the 14th button. Suddenly, the elevator ground to a halt and beeped 3 times. The door slid open and we realised we were stuck between floors. Terry was about to slide out through the opening when I grabbed him and held him back. I told him it was too dangerous. If the elevator started up again, while we were getting out, we could be sliced in half. Instead, I jabbed the emergency button. The elevator groaned again and the doors slowly slid shut with a clang. "What's going on?" asked Terry. I shook my head and replied, "I don't know." As we stood there shivering, the lights in the elevator suddenly went off and we plunged into darkness. Then one of the buttons on the panel lit up. It was the button for the 13th floor. None of us had pressed the button. It was simply lit up by itself. Supposed to be able to light up. It shouldn't be able to light up. There was no 13th floor. To our complete utter horror, we felt the elevator slowly move up. June jabbed the stop button, but it didn't work. We watched as the floors passed by 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Then there was a sound of scraping metal and the elevator ground to a halt. The doors slid open and we were staring into the pitch darkness. All three of us huddled together in the elevator, too petrified to move. Just then we heard a faint noise in the murky blackness. It made our hair stand up on end. Squelch, squelch. It was a wet and sticky noise, kind of noise you get when you throw a wet cloth against a wall. Squelch, 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 squelch. Sounded like something soggy dragging across the floor. As we strained our ears to listen, trembling in fear, the sounds grew faster, gathering pace. Squelch, 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 squelch. Then there was a sickly, mouldy smell in the air. It was like the stench of rotten meat. Sounds picked up pace, getting faster and faster. Squelch, 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 squelch. Just then it sounded like it was almost upon us. The elevator suddenly sprang to life. The doors began to close. The stench of death and decay was unbearable. As soon as the elevator doors shut with a clang, something smashed into them with a wet slap. The elevator creaked and began to go down. When the doors finally opened, we found ourselves on the ground floor. My father was standing there. When I saw him, I jumped up and embraced him. I still wonder what would have happened if he hadn't pressed a button to call the elevator at that exact moment.
Ugh.
Kind of reminds us of that game we played the other week with the elevator.
Oh, yeah. That was creepy.
Just sort of remind you of that game a little.
Thanks. That scared the life out of me. I'm not a massive fan of elevators as it is,
Well, me
but
neither.
so the next one I've got is called Till Death Do Us Part.
Mm.
Oh. A newly married couple, Bill and Mabel, bought a house in a nice secluded part of Maine. After they moved in, the neighbors came to visit and warned them that their house was haunted. Bill and Mabel disregarded the tales that they heard from their neighbors. They didn't believe in ghosts, and they weren't about to start now, just because of some silly neighbors that believed in the paranormal. But Mabel was curious about the history of the house, and she contacted the real estate agent and told him that she had heard odd stories about the house being haunted. The realtor said, by law, he should really have disclosed the history of the house and apologized for not doing so. Apparently, there had been a string of horrible murders committed in the house before an insane serial killer. The murders were only discovered after the killer had died. He'd been smoking in bed when he fell asleep and accidentally dropped a cigarette on his bed sheets. The bed caught fire and he burnt alive without ever waking up. His corpse had lain uncovered in the house for years, abandoned and rotting, and eventually the police had broken in and found his decomposing body in the bed. They dug up the garden and found remains of his victims. The story unnerved Mabel, and she began to have nightmares about the serial killer. She told her husband that she was beginning to believe that the stories of the haunting could be true, and Mabel frequently complained about the feeling that someone was in the room during the night, and sometimes she would wake suddenly, convinced that she had felt cold, bony hands touching her. Bill thought that Mabel was just being silly, but to keep his wife happy, she promised to stay up all night and keep watch over her. Bill was confident that if she woke up after feeling the cold, bony hands and nobody was there, then she would realize it was all in her imagination and part of her dreams. True to his word, Bill stayed up the whole night. Although around midnight the room began to feel uncomfortably warm, and he was gripped by the feeling of an overwhelming thirst. Leaving Mabel sleeping softly, he went downstairs to the kitchen to get a glass of water. Upstairs in the darkened room, Mabel awoke with a start. She heard footsteps just outside the door, and then someone came into the room, climbed into bed, and pulled the covers over them. She assumed it was her husband, Bill, and she leaned over in the bed to give him a kiss, but her lips touched something cold, bony, and slimy. Bill heard the most horrible scream coming from Mabel's room. He rushed upstairs and screamed in horror at what he found. Mabel's dead body lay stretched out on the bed, her face twisted in an expression of pure terror, and Bill rushed downstairs to call the police. Many weeks later, Bill was finally able to sleep peacefully. Until around midnight, again the feeling of intense thirst. He went downstairs and got a glass of water. When he came back to the bedroom, he was surprised to see a large lump in the bed. It was moving. He ran over and ripped off the bed sheets. To his utter surprise and disgust, the ghost of Mabel was sat up in the bed. She had tears in her eyes, and her cheeks were hollow and sunken. The dark form of another man crouched beside her in an animalistic manner, and a terrible skeletal man with the face of a desiccated corpse. The skeleton man clutched Mabel's head in his cold, bony grasps, forcing him to kiss her. Tears streaming down Mabel's face. In her hand she held a large knife. "Didn't you promise, Billy? Didn't you promise? Till death do us part. You promised," screamed Mabel as she slowly made her way towards the frightened and paralyzed Bill. Mm,
Wow, that's taking it literally.
I know. Can you imagine, like, snogging a corpse?
No, thank you.
No, thank you.
Not into necrophilia.
No, same.
So my next one is one specially for you, Amy,
Okay.
called The Sad Clown.
Oh no.
So, a few days ago, I had a really strange dream. This is true, by the way. I was standing on a long, narrow road that leads to my school. It was strangely quiet. No wind was blowing, no birds were singing, and no insects were chirping. The road was completely empty, and there was nobody else around. I began walking down the street. Just then, I got the strangest feeling that someone was watching me. Looking back over my shoulder, I spotted a small figure in the distance. It seemed to be running at full speed. I kept walking, but every time I glanced behind me, the figure was closer. The whole thing made me very uneasy. It just kept gaining on me, drawing closer and closer. At one point, I stopped in my tracks and looked back. The figure had stopped too. It was just standing there in the middle of the road, staring at me. When I started walking again, the figure began running after me. Eventually, the figure got close enough for me to make out its face. It was a clown, one of those sad clowns you see in paintings. He was
Oh.
dressed in a shabby hat and a threadbare coat like a hobo. The way he was staring at me really frightened me, and for a moment I thought, if he catches me, he will kill me. I wanted to run, but for some reason I couldn't. My legs felt heavy and I could barely lift my feet. It was all I could do to just keep the same pace. The clown kept getting closer and closer, and the next time I glanced back, I could see the clown's eyes. He was crying. I saw my school in the distance, and feeling relief wash over me. Something told me that if I could get there before he caught me, I'd be safe. Just as I reached the main gate of the school, I turned round one last time, and the clown was right behind me. His hand gripped my shoulder and whirled me around. The most terrifying thing was his face. He wasn't angry at all. Instead, he had a desperate, haunted look. Tears were streaming down his painted cheeks. "Caught you," he said. Then, to my surprise, he just let go of me and walked away. I stood there, dumbfounded. How could I have been so stupid? I had been scared for no reason. I began laughing at myself. But then the clown stopped in his tracks and turned around. He took a rusty knife from his pocket and held it up to his face. "The second time I catch you, I have to cut you," he said. "The third time, I'll have to kill you. See you next time." With that, the clown wiped the tears from his face and walked away. I woke up in a cold sweat. Ever since that dream, I have been too terrified to go to bed. For days, I've been filling up on coffee and Coca-Cola, trying desperately to stay awake. I don't dare shut my eyes even for one moment. I'm afraid if I fall asleep and I dream, I know the clown will be there waiting for me.
Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
That's a fucking nightmare.
That's gonna be my nightmare tonight. For anybody that doesn't know, I have coulrophobia. So
Oh,
I've got a phobia of clowns,
yep.
and that would be one of my absolute worst nightmares. Just I got goosebumps now just thinking of a clown. It's made me feel uneasy.
Good, it's done its job.
Ugh. So my next one is the white arm. It's only a small one. So uh one story concerned a lady named Margaret who lived in a beautiful old Georgian house. Her family had many ghostly encounters, but there was one that made her skin crawl. When she stayed up late one night to watch a TV show, and her husband and two daughters were up in bed, tucked in safely, she became aware of the latch on the door to the lounge lifting very, very slowly. She knew she was alone downstairs. Everybody in her family was upstairs dreaming peacefully. She wasn't scared, just curious. And then the door opened, inch by inch, creak by creak. And as she watched, a huge white arm came around the door and began to slowly beckon to her with its long, white skeletal finger. Margaret was frozen to the spot. Whoever or whatever was behind the door must have been enormous, and the angle of the arm meant that the owner must have been at least 7 foot tall. The arm was white, so very, very white. By this time, Margaret was terrified, and the arm continued to beckon to her, and then slowly began to withdraw behind the door. Yet the door stayed open. Summoning all her courage, Margaret forced herself to get up and go to the door. Yet there was nobody there. The room was completely empty, quiet, and dark, just as it had been earlier in the evening. As Margaret withdrew from the room, she could feel a breath upon her door, and the back of her shoulders were icy cold. As she looked back over, she could see those long, thin, white fingers reaching out of the darkness, and before she could move, they curled around her shoulder. After that, nobody ever heard of Margaret again. It was just a little one.
Creepy.
Creepy, creepy. Hi, Norway.
Anyway, right. So my last story is called Basement Room.
Mm.
Years ago, my family went on a vacation in Cape Cod, and we rented a small old house to stay in for 2 weeks. On the main floor was the kitchen, the living room, and a bathroom. Bedrooms were on the second floor. There was a basement room downstairs with a washer and dryer, a sofa, and a television. On the first night, we were all awakened by a terrible scream from my sister's bedroom. When my dad burst into her room and turned on the light, he found us sitting up in bed, screaming and crying. My parents sat with her and comforted her until she finally calmed down enough to tell them what had scared her. She said that she'd been wakened in the middle of the night by a horrible stench. When she opened her eyes, she'd seen the entire bedroom soaked in blood from top to bottom. There was blood all over the floor, bloody handprints on the walls, and blood splatter all over the ceiling. We all thought that she had just been having a nightmare, but she refused to go back into her bedroom and stayed in her parents' room for the remainder of the holiday. One evening, my mother was cooking dinner in the kitchen upstairs, and my father had gone out on an errand in the nearby town. My sister and I were in the basement room watching TV when all of a sudden the light bulb popped and the TV went off, leaving us in complete darkness. The basement was unfurnished and had some old stone walls, making it a bit of a creepy place. For a few seconds we just froze, not knowing what to do. Then we started to smell something horrible. It was a terrible stench, and when it hit our noses we felt nauseous. smelled like rotten flesh. The smell quickly grew worse and worse, and then when we just heard, and then we started to hear scratching in the darkness. Something seemed to be scratching at the floor and the walls. We screamed and began scrambling around in the pitch black, trying to find the door. Eventually, we managed to open the door and ran upstairs, screaming to our mother. We kept telling her that the disgusting smell and we heard something scratching and scraping down there. My mother eventually agreed to go down to the basement and replace the bulb and check out the source of the horrible smell. She took a flashlight and a new bulb and disappeared into the darkened basement. As we waited for her at the top of the stairs, we expected her to return quickly, but she seemed to be down there for an eternity. Suddenly, we saw her emerge out of the darkness and came running up the stairs. She slammed the basement door behind her and bolted it as fast as she could. She turned to us and we could see her face and completely drained of colour. Her eyes were wide with fear and she just said, "I don't want you going down there again." Then she sent then she went to the kitchen and called the police. We overheard a conversation on the phone and managed to figure out that she'd seen someone down in the basement room. As we waited for the police to come, we huddled together in the living room, staring at the basement door. At any moment, we expected to hear someone banging or trying to break it down. My mother refused to tell us what she'd seen. When the police arrived, my mother greeted them at the front door and ushered them inside. She unbolted the basement door and they went down into the darkness with their flashlights out and their guns drawn. They searched the entire basement room, but nothing was found. There was no other way out of the basement, no windows, no doors. Whatever was down there would have had to have come up through the basement door. After the police left, my mother finally revealed what she'd seen down there in the pitch black basement. As she spoke, she became very still and quiet. She said that she'd been changing the light bulb downstairs when she began to smell the horrible stench we had described to her. Then she started to hear a faint scratching noise. She shone her flashlight around the room and suddenly caught sight of something crouched between the washer and the dryer. It was a man, crouched on all fours. His clothes were tattered, his hair was wild and tangled, and his face didn't look human. It was twisted in an expression of pure hatred. In that split second, he looked up at my mother. His eyes was reflecting the beam from her flashlight. Then he suddenly crawled forward and disappeared through a wall where my mother saw him simply vanish into thin air. She dropped the flashlight and ran. After that, none of us would go down in the basement, kept the door locked and bolted every night. We slept in our parents' room and locked that door too. We cut our holiday short a few days later and just drove home.
Oh, creepy. That's probably why I don't like basements either.
No.
Okay, guys, so we've got one more left. This one's more of a bit of a question and a bit of a warning. So, have you ever really looked at yourself in a mirror? I mean, have you ever stared into your own eyes of your own reflection and wondered, what is it thinking? It might sound absurd and ridiculous. It's just your own reflection, right? So, why does it make you feel uncomfortable when you look at yourself in a mirror? Why do you get the feeling that someone's watching you? I mean, you automatically trust your own reflection, right? Because it looks like you. It seems like that. It couldn't do you any harm. It used to put you off your guard. Take a closer look. If you move suddenly, you'll notice that your reflection is always a split second behind. Its reactions are quick and it anticipates your every move, but it's not quite quick enough. So when you notice this irregularity, don't give any sign that you saw it. Make sure that you don't know. It doesn't know that you know it made a mistake. Just walk away and act as if nothing happened. Now you have the advantage. Well,
Mm.
again, this is why I don't like mirrors.
I don't mind mirrors, but I don't like the only mirrors I have is I have one in the hallway and one in the bathroom. I don't have them in the bedroom.
Mm, we've got one in the front room, one in the bedroom.
Never trust mirrors.
No. So,
So that
yay.
is the
Podcast on ghost
podcast.
stories.
Yep, for this week. Uh,
If you've got any ghost stories that you'd like to add or let us know, join the Discord. It's in the About Us section. Let us know on there. Any ghost stories that you know or anything that's happened to you.
yeah, and experiences, stuff like that.
And if you want, we could read them out on the next podcast.
Yep, that can
So,
that concludes today's podcast. Yep. We will be streaming Left 4 Dead straight afterwards. So just bear with us for give us 5 minutes, and then we'll be streaming again.
mhm,
Thank you for watching this week's podcast. I hope you enjoyed the stories, and we shall see you all in next week's podcast.
yeah.
So, yeah, see you all in a bit.
Bye bye.